The maintenance corridor smelled like recycled air and old metal, and Will had long since stopped noticing either. He moved through Sector 9 with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible, mop in one hand, scanner in the other, checking the atmospheric seals the way a doctor checks a pulse. Routine, predictable, safe. He had built his entire life around those three words since the accident, and he was not about to let a strange blinking light in the restricted cargo bay ruin that. Except the light wasn't supposed to be there. He almost ignored it. He was good at ignoring things. It was one of the few skills that had survived the last 3 years intact. But the light pulsed in a rhythm that was almost biological, something between a heartbeat and a distress signal, and something in Will's chest responded to it before his brain had the chance to say no. He pushed the cargo bay door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. What he found crouched behind crate B-17 was not a malfunction. It was not a faulty atmospheric relay or a misrouted power conduit. It was a being approximately the height of a 12-year-old child, wrapped in a thermal sheet that was clearly not doing its job anymore, with 4 fingers pressed against a wound in its side that glowed faint gold and then dimmed, pulsing in that same broken rhythm Will had seen through the door. The being's eyes were enormous, iridescent in the way deep-sea creatures are iridescent, built for darkness and pressure, and they fixed on Will with an expression he had no vocabulary for. But his body understood it immediately. That expression was terror wearing the mask of composure. He had worn it himself, every day for 3 years. He recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Will didn't move. He didn't call security. He didn't reach for the emergency comm clipped to his belt, even though his fingers found it by reflex. He just stood there in the threshold of Crate Bay 9, holding his mop, while an alien heiress he had absolutely no way of knowing was an heiress bled golden light onto the floor of the station he swept for a living. And he said the only thing that came naturally to him in a moment of complete bewilderment. "You need help," he said, not a question. The creature flinched so hard it knocked its own shoulder against the crate, and that flinch told Will everything. Whatever this being was, wherever they had come from, they had heard that sentence before, and had learned to be afraid of what came after it. That was the moment Will set the mop down. He would spend a long time later wondering if that was where everything truly began. Not with the light, not with the blood, but with the sound of a mop handle resting quietly against a metal wall. The most ordinary sound in the universe. The beginning of the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to him. The station was called Aselion Waypoint, and it occupied an unglamorous stretch of space between two mining sectors that nobody powerful cared about, which was precisely why Will had chosen it. After the Corinthus incident, that was what the news feeds called it, the Corinthus incident, as though giving it a tidy name made it tidier. Will Archer had needed a place where nobody would find him important enough to look at. Aselion Waypoint was perfect. 1,200 residents, mostly contractors and traders, a rotating cast of station staff that changed every 18 months, and a night shift so understaffed that the maintenance crew was exactly one person on any given Tuesday. That person was Will. He was 34 years old, with the kind of face that people described as trustworthy without ever really meaning it as a compliment, and hands that shook slightly in the cold, a remnant of nerve damage that the medical report had classified as minor, and Will had classified as a daily reminder. He had been a xenobiologist once, a good one, working field assignments in the outer sectors, publishing papers, building something that looked like a career. Then the Corinthus incident had happened, and 3 people had died, and the courts had found no criminal negligence, and that finding had somehow made it worse rather than better, because Will had no verdict to appeal, and no sentence to serve out, and no clear end to the punishment he was giving himself. Ixelian Waypoint, night shift, Sector 9. He had been here for 14 months. He had spoken to exactly one person with any regularity, and that was Casey Bright, the communications officer who worked the adjacent shift and occasionally left coffee outside his locker with a sticky note that said things like, "You're not as invisible as you think, and please eat a vegetable." He had not acted on either suggestion. He had not expected to act on anything. And then the light had pulsed behind the cargo bay door. The being did not move when Will approached. It tracked him with those enormous refracted eyes. He could see now that the irises rotated slightly, the way a camera lens adjusts for depth, which meant exceptional peripheral vision, probably a species that had evolved in open terrain where predators came from every direction. He filed that observation away with the automatic reflex of a mind trained for a decade to notice things, then felt immediately guilty for it, because this was not a field specimen, and he was not a scientist anymore. "I'm not going to report you," he said, keeping his voice at the pitch he used for frightened animals, which he recognized immediately was probably offensive and adjusted for. "I'm not armed. I work here. I clean things." The being's four-fingered hand tightened against its wound. The gold light pulsed and dimmed. Up close, it was clearly bioluminescent. The light wasn't from an external source, but from within the body, which meant the dimming was metabolic failure, not equipment malfunction. Will's hands moved before he'd made any decision, reaching into the maintenance kit on his belt and producing the emergency pressure bandage he carried for his own shaky hands on bad days, sealed in its plastic wrap, completely sterile. He held it out. Simple as that. An emergency pressure bandage in a plastic wrapper, the kind you could buy at any station med kiosk for 2 credits. The being stared at it for a very long time. Then they said something. It came out in a frequency that wasn't quite sound, more like sound adjacent, something that vibrated in Will's molars and behind his eyes, and the station's translator beat in his ear, standard issue, Excellion Waypoint maintenance staff, model 4 years out of date, worked for a moment and then produced, "You offer your sustenance wrap to a," and then a word the bead rendered as worthless stratified one, before apparently giving up on the translation entirely. Will frowned. "It's a bandage. For the," he gestured at the wound, "the glowing part." Another long pause. The being tilted its head at an angle that a human neck couldn't have managed, considering him with an intensity that felt like being read rather than seen. Then they took the bandage. Their name was Kayla. Will learned this in pieces over the following hour, during which he did not report the unauthorized presence in the cargo bay, did not contact station security, and did not think about any of the 17 regulations he was violating, because Kayla was applying the pressure bandage with the determined focus of someone who had never asked for help before and was refusing to acknowledge that they were doing it now. And something about that particular stubbornness made Will want to stay exactly where he was. She was, he used the pronoun tentatively, asking first with gestures and getting what seemed like an affirmative tilting of the head, Veilthari. He had read about them in papers but never encountered one in person, which was not surprising. The Veilthari were reclusive to a degree that bordered on mythological. Their home system, Maranthus, operated under a closed border policy that had been in place for 2 centuries. They did not attend diplomatic functions. They did not trade on open markets. They appeared in academic literature mostly as the subject of other species speculation, and in station rumors mostly as ghost stories. They did not, as a matter of iron cultural law, interact with what they called the unmarked, species with no formal standing in the Great Conclave, no hereditary record, no recognized lineage. Humans, who had stumbled into the wider galaxy barely 60 years ago and were still in the process of convincing everyone that they were worth acknowledging, were emphatically unmarked, which meant that Kayla, by speaking to Will at all, was violating something considerably more serious than 17 maintenance regulations. The pressure bandage seemed to be helping. The golden light steadied, stopped its alarming dimming pattern, held at a low, continuous glow. Kayla sat with her back against crate B-17 and watched Will with those rotating iris eyes while he sat cross-legged on the cargo bay floor 3 meters away, not crowding her, just present. "You did not summon others," she said, when the translator bead had apparently recalibrated enough to manage basic syntax. "No." "Why?" It wasn't phrased as a question, which he was beginning to understand might be a Veilthari grammatical structure rather than rudeness. "Because you needed help before you needed anything else," he said. Her head tilted again. "You expect return." "I really don't. All unmarked expect return." The translator bead put something clipped and categorical into her voice, the rhythm of someone reciting established fact. "Benefit is currency. Gift requires debt. This is unmarked law." Will thought about this carefully. "That's a pretty bleak read of us." "It is accurate." "It's sometimes accurate," he said. "Not always." She considered that with the same rotating iris intensity. "You are a maintenance worker." "Yes." "You have no status, no lineage record, no standing in any conclave register." "That's also accurate." "Then you have nothing to gain by my continued existence." Will looked at the steady gold glow behind the pressure bandage, and then looked at Kayla's face. At that expression he had recognized at the door, composure over terror, endurance dressed up as control, and said, "I had a bad couple of years. I know what it feels like to be somewhere you didn't plan to be. hurt in a way you can't explain, not sure if asking for help is going to make things better or worse. I didn't think twice. A silence opened up between them that was different from the silences before it, less watchful, more complicated. Something is happening here. Will felt it the way you feel a pressure change before weather. Not yet visible, not yet nameable, but absolutely real. Over the next several hours, while Exelion Waypoint's night cycle turned and the corridor outside Sector 9 stayed empty, Will learned things in fragments. Kayla did not volunteer information. She observed him, tested him with silences, offered small, precise statements the way someone places a foot on ice before committing to their weight. He learned that she was injured because her transit vessel had been ambushed. He learned that she had separated from her security detail as a deliberate act to preserve their lives rather than her own, and that she referred to this decision with the same flat affect she used for meteorological observations, as though the idea that her life might be worth less than theirs was simply arithmetic. He learned that she had been in the cargo bay for 31 hours before he found her. What he did not learn yet, what she was not ready to tell him, and what he was careful not to push for, was why she was traveling at all, what she was traveling toward, and why the beings who had attacked her vessel bore the insignia of her own people. He made her eat something. This was where the cultural misread happened, and it was both alarming and, in retrospect, briefly wonderful. He had protein bars in his maintenance kit. Everyone on night shift carried them because the commissary closed at 2200, and he unwrapped one and placed it on the floor in the midpoint between them and slid it toward her with 2 fingers, which he intended as an offering, but which apparently, in Veilthari's symbolic language, constituted a declaration that he considered their relationship to be in a state of formal obligation, which was the nearest he could translate what Kayla explained in a rapid sequence of translator beat approximations that culminated in her going very still and saying, "You have just claimed guardianship." "I absolutely have not," Will said. 2-finger placement. Item at threshold distance. This is, the bead struggled. This is vow of provision. It's a protein bar. The gesture. I was sliding it because I didn't want to come closer and scare you. Another long, recalibrating silence. Then something happened to Kayla's face. Something the muscles around her jaw and her brow undertook that wasn't quite a human expression, but occupied the same emotional territory as the moment right before someone laughs for the first time in a very long time. "You are," she said carefully, "extraordinarily clumsy for a vow maker." "You can keep the protein bar," Will said. "No obligations attached, I promise." She ate it. She ate it with the focused, deliberate manner of someone who had not eaten in 31 hours and was refusing to acknowledge hunger as weakness. And Will watched the corridor door and didn't say anything about it, and that felt important. If you're finding yourself pulled into this world, this kind of story is what this channel is all about. Consider subscribing so you never miss one. Around the 4th hour, Kayla told him about the wound. She didn't call it that. She stated facts in the same flat effect tone she used for everything. But the facts arranged themselves into a shape that Will recognized, and the shape was grief. She had a younger sibling. She used a Veilthari word the translator rendered as continuation self, which he understood to mean the sibling who would carry the family's essential memory forward. Her continuation self had been selected, 3 years ago, to participate in a diplomatic effort that the Veilthari ruling council officially denied was happening. Back-channel contact with 3 of the unmarked species, building the groundwork for what might, eventually, become an opening of Maranthus. A quiet revolution accomplished through patience. The continuation self had died. The bead couldn't render what had been done to them in any vocabulary Will could hear without his stomach turning. It had been made to look like illness. Everyone in power knew it wasn't. Kayla had spent 3 years following the evidence. She had assembled a case against 4 members of the ruling council. She was traveling to present that case to the one body that had authority over the council, a tribunal that met on neutral ground once every cycle in a station that was neither Veilthari nor Conclave territory. She was traveling to Ixelion Waypoint. The ambush made sense now. The attackers bearing her own people's insignia made sense. The 31 hours alone in the dark made sense. Will sat with all of this for a long moment. Outside, the corridor hummed with recycled air. Somewhere in Sector 7, a pressure seal ticked through its automated cycle. The most ordinary sounds in the universe, surrounding the most extraordinary thing. "The tribunal convenes in 16 hours, Kayla said. "I know," Will said. And then, because she was looking at him with those rotating iris eyes, and the composure over terror expression was back, fully deployed, armor back in place. I'm going to help you get there. You have no standing. You are unmarked. They will not admit you to the chamber. I don't need to go in the chamber. He was already running the station layout in his mind. The route from Sector 9 to the Tribunal Annex, the shift changes, the security blind spots he knew from 14 months of being the person nobody watched. I just need to get you to the door. Why? Not a question. Because you came 31 hours without asking anyone for help, and then I walked in with a mop and you still almost didn't take the bandage. He met her eyes directly. Somebody should show up for you, that's all. The first crack came quietly. He almost missed it. It was not a dramatic collapse, not a flood of emotion. It was smaller than that and more devastating. Kayla looked away from him, turning those extraordinary eyes toward the far wall, and the composure held, but around the edges of it something shifted, the way ice shifts when a current underneath it changes direction. Her hand, still pressed to the now stable wound, opened slightly. 4 fingers instead of a fist, not a release, but a loosening. Will looked away to give her privacy for it. Getting out of Sector 9 without triggering the security logs required Will to remember things he had not thought about in 14 months. Not maintenance things, but the other things, the professional skills that had survived the accident even when he'd decided they hadn't survived the guilt. Observation, pattern recognition, understanding how systems worked and where their attention was directed. He moved through the station with Kayla close behind him, her thermal sheet swapped for a maintenance coverall that was 3 sizes too large and successfully concealed the bioluminescent glow, and he narrated the route in a low voice. Camera cycle here is 19 seconds. We move on my count. And she followed his lead with a trust that he understood was costing her significantly. The corridor outside the tribunal annex was not empty. 2 men, unmarked contractor class, with weapons that were technically prohibited on Exelian Waypoint and practically inevitable in a station that checked cargo rather than people. They were watching the annex door with the patient attention of professionals who had been paid to ensure a specific outcome. Will did not have a weapon. He had a maintenance scanner, a pressure bandage kit, 2 remaining protein bars, and 14 months of being the person nobody watched. He turned to Kayla. Stay here. I'll clear the way. They will harm you. Probably. He offered her a small, honest shrug. The protein bar was free too. He walked toward the men before she could argue, choosing the specific posture of someone with nowhere interesting to be and nothing worth taking, the posture he had perfected on every night shift for over a year. And when he was close enough, he triggered the emergency pressure alarm on his scanner, which sent a deafening alert through sectors 8 through 11 and caused both men to turn instinctively toward the sound. And in those 4 seconds, Will moved with a speed and precision that surprised him considerably, because the nerve damage in his hands had not reached his elbows, and his former field training had apparently not entirely left his body, even if he'd tried hard to leave it behind. He wasn't uninjured afterward, but the path to the door was clear. Kayla was at his side in an instant. She looked at his split lip and the shoulder he was already going to have to explain to Casey in the morning, and something moved across her face that the translator bead was not equipped to render, but that his body understood the same way it had understood her terror at the cargo bay door. She reached out, 4 fingers, open, a different gesture than the formal 2-finger placement, and touched his arm. It was brief. It was careful. It carried the weight of an entire vocabulary she didn't have words for in any language they shared. The early detail returned to him then. The mop handle, resting against the metal wall, the smallest possible sound at the beginning of the largest possible night. He thought about how much had pivoted on that single moment of setting something down, putting down the routine, choosing presence over invisibility for the first time in 3 years. He thought about what Casey's sticky notes had been trying to tell him. Go, he said. You have a case to present. Present it. Kayla held his gaze with those refracted ocean floor eyes. When the tribunal concludes, she said carefully, and the translator bead was doing its best, I will require the bead offered, record witness, one who has observed my conduct in difficulty and can attest to character without formal lineage. She paused. This is a recognized standing in the conclave system. It would make you, another pause, the bead searching, not entirely unmarked. Will stood in the corridor of Exelian Waypoint with a split lip and shaking hands, the cold and the adrenaline together making them worse than usual, and he felt something he had not felt in 3 years, which was the specific sensation of a future that was not just an extension of punishment, but something genuinely unknown, genuinely open, stretching forward in a direction he hadn't planned. "I'll be here," he said. She went through the door. He sat down against the corridor wall, pulled out the last protein bar, and waited. The tribunal lasted 4 hours. He ate the protein bar in the first 30 minutes and then just sat, which was something he had gotten quite good at, though the quality of the waiting felt different than it used to, less like endurance and more like intention. Casey found him at some point in the third hour, drawn by the security alert that had apparently generated a maintenance work order, and stood over him with an expression that moved through confusion, alarm, and something like exasperated fondness in rapid succession. "You're bleeding," she said. "I noticed." "What happened?" "Long night," he said, which was true, which covered approximately none of it. The door opened in the fourth hour, and Kayla walked out, and the way she held herself was different. The composure was still there, it would probably always be there, built into her at a cellular level, but it was no longer a mask over terror. It was simply how she stood. The tribunal had accepted the case. The council members in question would face formal proceeding. Her continuation self's truth would be heard. She crossed the corridor and stood before Will Archer, a night shift maintenance worker on an unglamorous waypoint station at the edge of two sectors nobody powerful cared about. And she looked at him with her rotating iris eyes, and for the first time he saw what lived behind them without the armor in the way. Gratitude was there, yes, but deeper than gratitude. The particular vulnerability of someone who has been reached after they had finished believing they could be. "You shook," she said, meaning his hands, which were still at it, the nerve damage and the cold and the aftermath, all compounding. During the corridor, "You shook, and you moved anyway." "Yeah," he said. "I did not know unmarked could do that." He stood up slowly, favoring the shoulder. "We're full of surprises." Casey was staring between them, with an expression that suggested her morning was not going the way she'd expected, which Will felt was fair. Kayla was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in that precise, careful, recalibrated way of someone building a sentence in a language they're choosing to learn, "The record witness roll. It is not a small thing. There will be other hearings, other corridors." Her eyes moved to his still trembling hands. "Other nights." Will thought about a mop handle resting against a metal wall. He thought about a light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He thought about 3 years of practicing invisibility so thoroughly he'd nearly convinced himself it was the same thing as peace. "I've got the time," he said. Something settled between them then. Not a beginning, not an ending, but the specific gravity of two people who have found each other in the dark and decided, quietly, that neither of them has to navigate back alone. Some things you don't plan. They simply pulse behind a door you almost walk past, and the entire shape of who you are depends on whether you push it open. Will had pushed it open. He was not invisible anymore. Thank you so much for spending this time with this story. If you made it to the end, it means the world. If this moved something in you, consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and turning on notifications so you never miss a new story. Every week, we bring you new worlds, new connections, and new characters who remind us what it means to be human, wherever in the universe that might be. See you in the next one.